Alright, so for our first video, we're going to look at some geometry, and we're going to talk about parallel lines, specifically parallel lines cut by what we call a transversal. So here I've got two parallel lines, and I know that they're parallel because of these little triangles. Now sometimes it'll be triangles, sometimes it'll be little arrows, but they'll always label them if they're parallel, right? And this other line that cuts through both, that's what we call a transversal. And there are five main angle relationships that you need to know, and you need to make sure you have memorized and you can recognize them if I show you a picture with parallel lines. So the first one is what we call corresponding angles. So if you notice here, I've got two intersections, right? And they look the same because I've got a line coming straight through, this parallel on top and bottom, and then I have this other line that cuts through the same way. Right? So that means that these intersections are indeed the same. So what we call like A and E, because they're in the same spot of each intersection, those are our corresponding angles. Right? So we have several sets of corresponding angles. We've got, let's see, A and E, then you got B and F, C and G, and then D and H. So all of those are in the same spot, just different intersections. Our corresponding angles are congruent. That's the relationship with all of our corresponding angles. Just side note, remember our symbol for congruent is the equal sign with a little squiggle above it. Okay, vertical angles, right? Vertical kind of means on top of each other, and they sort of kind of are, not so much in this drawing, but vertical angles are if you have an intersection, it's the angles that are on top of each other, right? So if I were to come back here and look at all of my vertical angles, I've got A and D, and then B and C, and down here we got E and H, and F and G. Okay, all of our vertical angles are also congruent. So all of those sets are congruent. Okay, alternate interior angles, right? Well, interior means inside, so that means that I'm going to be inside of my parallel lines. And then alternate means kind of like opposites, like you're alternating sides, you're changing sides. So I only have two sets. I've got C and F, right, because these are on either side of that transversal, but it's in between my parallel lines. And then I got D and E. Okay, then we have alternate exterior angles, which is the same idea except that I'm on the outside of my parallel lines. So I've got A and H, and then B and G. All right. If we go back to what we know about vertical angles and our corresponding angles, right, I know that A and E are the same, okay, because they're corresponding angles. And I know that E and H are the same because they're vertical angles, which means that A and H have to be the same, right? So our alternate exterior angles are all congruent. Now, not congruent to each other. G and E are not congruent, or sorry, G and H are not congruent, but B and G are, and A and H are. Okay, so the pairs of alternate exterior angles are congruent. All right, and then interior angles, same idea, right? If I know that A and E are in the same spot, right, and then A and D are vertical angles, that means D and E have to be congruent. So far, all of the different types of angles are congruent to each other. All right, consecutive angles. Consecutive means like next to. Right? So you have a bunch of different types of consecutive angles here, and I just left it as consecutive because it works in all the ways, but normally you see consecutive interior angles, which is talking in here, and that means that they're on the same side of that transversal, right? These are right next to each other, okay, and then C and E are right next to each other, but it also works for like B and D and A and B. A and C, E, F, F, H, H, G, and G, E. So anytime you have two angles that are directly next to each other, all right, then that means they are consecutive angles. Okay, so there's a bunch. I'm not going to write them all down, but like D and F, right, and then let's see, A and B, right, and then there's a bunch more. We'll put dot, 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 because we're not going to list them all. But consecutive angles are not congruent, right? Because I know that A and B, right? They're not any of these four, but they do make up a line, right? Oh, it's not a very pretty line. Okay, and we know that a line consists of 180 degrees, right? If I'm completely flat, that's 180 degrees, which means that A and B have to add to 180. Well, we have a word for that, and that's supplementary. So all the consecutive angles are supplementary, right? And we'll add a note. That means that they're going to add to 180. So D plus F has to equal 180. G plus H has to equal 180. Okay, so we've got 5 angle relationships here that you've got to be able to recognize and name, as well as know if they're congruent or supplementary and use it to solve for X or a missing angle, something that you need to find. So I got 3 examples. The first one here, okay, I've got a 60 and an 8x minus 4. Okay, they're in different intersections, right? But they're not in the same spots. They're not corresponding. They're not vertical. Okay, they are on the inside of our parallel line, so it does make them interior, and they're on different sides of that transversal. So these are going to be alternate interior angles. All right, and I know that alternate interior angles are congruent, which means I can set these equal to each other, and that's going to let me solve for x. All right, so I can add 4 and divide by 8. So that means x equals 8. Now, I didn't write any instructions here, but pay attention to what your instructions are asking. If it wants to know what x is, I'm done, right? But if it wanted to know what an angle was, I might have to plug x back in. So just pay attention to what it's asking for. All right, for number 2, okay, these are in the same spot of each intersection. So that means that these are going to be corresponding angles. And we know the corresponding angles are congruent. So that means I can set them equal to each other and solve. So first I'm going to get the x's on the same side. So I'm going to move the 21x over. All right, 23 minus 21 is 2. All right, and then add the 5 over. Let's see how much room I got. So then we got 2x equals 10. Divide by 2. So we get x equals 5. And again, if it wanted x, we would stop there. If it wanted the angle, you'd plug it back into one of these guys. All right, and then we've got these 2 angles that are not in the same intersection, right? And they are both inside, but they're not on different sides of the transversal. So that means they're not corresponding, they're not alternate interior or exterior, but they are next to each other. So they're directly next to each other, so that means that they're going to be consecutive angles. And consecutive angles are supplementary. So I'm not going to set these equal to each other, but I can add them together and set it equal to 180. So we could say 20x plus 5 plus 24x minus 1 has to equal 180. Okay, combine my like terms. So we got a 20x and a 24x. All right, and I got a 5 and a negative 1. And now we have an equation that's a little easier to solve. Okay, so I'm going to start by subtracting 4. So we get 44x equals 176. And then 176 divided by 44 is 4. So we get x equals 4. So you got to be able to name the relationship as well as solve for missing pieces, given whatever relationship you have.